Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of media. We're going to impartially analyze how a straight-up factual news hook can totally transform into a sweeping critique of modern institutions. We're looking closely at a recent segment from Glen Beck's show with his co-host Michaela. It starts off talking about a virus, but, well, it ends up somewhere completely different. And just to be clear, my goal today isn't to validate or debunk their claims. We're just here to break down the actual mechanics of the narrative they're building.
Okay, let's dive into this by tracing the segment's rhetorical journey through 4 distinct themes. 1, the Hantavirus outbreak. 2, generational pandemic fatigue. 3, institutional distrust and conspiracies. And 4, faith as the answer. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the Hantavirus outbreak, the viral baseline.
So the segment kicks off with a traditional news update about an outbreak of Hantavirus on a cruise ship down in Argentina, where 3 people tragically passed away. Now, the hosts immediately ground the threat by dropping a pretty stark number, a 38 to 40% mortality rate for the virus in the U.S. They established the objective severity of the topic right out of the gate. They even compare it to early COVID-19 figures, pointing out that while the alpha variant of COVID had an estimated 5.3% mortality rate, this virus is sitting way up there, closer to 40%. And they openly acknowledge that if this thing goes airborne, we're talking about a catastrophic scenario.
And this actually brilliantly illustrates the specific cause for their concern. They're talking about the Andes strain of the virus. You see, while typical hantavirus usually requires inhaling rodent feces, the Andes strain, the one from Argentina, is totally capable of human-to-human transmission. They highlight a literal logistical nightmare here, an 8-week incubation period. That means asymptomatic passengers from that cruise ship could just scatter across the globe completely undetected. Beck expresses, sheer frustration that these passengers weren't quarantined immediately, kind of joking that movies usually handle these scenarios way better than real-world officials do.
But despite these terrifying statistics, the hosts quickly pivot to some dark humor to deflate the threat. Michaela sarcastically offers her official doctorly advice, joking that she has a BFA in acting and pointing out that her co-host's husband literally went to clown school. Then they roll out this absurdly specific list of preventative medical advice, like avoiding rat-petting zoos. It's actually a pretty clever rhetorical device. Think about it. They present a very scary fact, but then use extreme, sarcastic humor to signal to the audience, hey, you shouldn't actually panic about this.
Let's move to Section 2, generational pandemic fatigue. A shift in anxiety. Now, what's really interesting here is how the conversation contrasts the different anxieties that are driving the host's mutual apathy toward this new virus. On one side, Glen Beck represents the older demographic, heavily focused on the political fallout of the last pandemic. He's fearing a repeat of forced lockdowns, masked children, and missing school. On the flip side, Michaela voices the anxieties of a younger generation. She argues that young people are just so paralyzed by doom scrolling and constant panic about everything, from climate change to pandemics, that they're actually driving themselves to extinction by failing to get married, start businesses, or have kids. She even playfully but pointedly brings up plummeting sperm counts as a much bigger concern than any new virus.
So the crucial point is captured perfectly in this quote from Michaela. Die with your boots on, but live with your boots on. The segment is basically arguing that constant environmental and medical alarmism is just toxic noise. Their collective response to a potential new pandemic, it isn't to prepare medically. Instead, it's to aggressively continue living normal, daily life in complete defiance of that fear.
Section 3, institutional distrust and conspiracies. Escalating the argument. Having firmly established their pandemic fatigue and their absolute refusal to panic, the hosts now shift into a rapid escalation of distrust toward medical and governmental authorities. They introduce some speculation about a mysterious, unverified X account prediction operating under the handle Soothsayer. Supposedly, this account posted back in 2022, predicting the end of corona in 2023 and a hantavirus outbreak in 2026. Now, even though the co-host admits she couldn't actually verify the origin of the account using digital archives, the mere existence of the rumor kicks the door wide open for some wild speculation. They start openly pondering if the post was planted by the World Health Organization, Anthony Fauci, or maybe Bill Gates.
And this rhetoric reveals just how incredibly deep their distrust runs. Host Glen Beck frames previous pandemic responses not as flawed public health measures, but as deliberate, malicious rehearsals for authoritarian control. Viewing the COVID pandemic as a big trial run completely reshapes how the audience is primed to view any future health directives. Think about it. Through this lens, any new restriction won't be seen as safety, it'll be seen as an expansion of control.
To justify this intense skepticism,
The hosts rattle off a whole catalog of allegations. They blend factual vaccine development timelines with unverified claims of financial collusion and government overreach. For instance, the fact that Moderna and the University of Bath are already developing an mRNA vaccine for Hantavirus, that's framed not as scientific foresight, but as deeply, deeply suspicious. Beck connects this directly to COVID, implying a pattern of manufactured crises. He also brings up past segments alleging wire transfers of vaccine profits going straight to the Federal Reserve and warns of impending draconian measures, even throwing in government kill switches in civilian cars.
All of this escalates and culminates in Beck's most intense rhetoric of the segment. He completely writes off the credibility of the entire medical establishment, even demanding jail time for officials like Dr. Fauci. Calling public health institutions a death cult is, rhetorically speaking, a real point of no return. Beck explicitly states that even if this specific virus is real, and even if it's deadly, he will categorically refuse any vaccine they produce. Why? Because in his view, the authorities have utterly and completely discredited themselves.
Section 4. Faith as the answer. The ultimate conclusion.
Which brings us to the final act of the segment. The hosts have to offer their audience a solution in a world where human authorities are now deemed fundamentally corrupt and dangerous. Because the medical establishment, the government, and global health organizations have allegedly failed the public, the segment asserts there's really only one reliable refuge left. Interestingly, Beck notes that even earthly religious institutions, like your own church, can lose credibility in these times. The only pure, untainted source of truth remaining, they argue, is God himself. This segment reaches its spiritual climax right here, with Beck pleading with his audience to rely exclusively on strict, unquestioning obedience to God for survival in future crises. He urges his listeners to pray that the Spirit is always with them and to do exactly what you're told no matter how crazy it sounds. It is a totally fascinating structural flip. The segment spends the vast majority of its time fiercely advocating for skepticism and outright disobedience toward human experts, only to wrap up by demanding total, unquestioning obedience to personal spiritual prompting.
As we wrap up this analysis, it really leaves us with a profound realization about the modern media ecosystem. We just watched a straightforward news story about a 38% mortality rate transform into a discussion about plummeting sperm counts, transition into allegations of a government death cult, and finalize as a sermon on divine obedience. It leaves us with this absolutely crucial question. When trust in human institutions fractures completely, where does a society turn for truth? Thank you for walking through this explainer with me. I hope tracing this narrative has given you a clearer understanding of how complex, multi-layered arguments are constructed in today's media landscape. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.